This is our panel is First Draft Between Fact and Fiction, and the title comes from a quote that is generally attributed to Philip Graham, publisher of the Washington Post: "Journalism is the first rough draft of history." And indeed, our three panelists are very distinguished journalists. When I read their bios, I'm not going to read every publication that they've been in because it's an extremely long list, and it includes the New York Times, Vogue, Harper's, Salon, The Guardian, Granta, etc. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about their books and what the work that they have done. Our three panelists have also written and published in lots of other genres, including the novel, the short story, memoir, personal essay, and biography. So we pretty much have it covered here. And I'm hoping what we can kind of get into today is asking our writers to talk about how they walk that delicate line between reporting narrative and sort of, well, inventing it, and how they keep themselves honest when they're supposed to be objective, and how they keep their personal stories personal without getting too personal, and then how they keep themselves out of their journalism pieces, which are intended to be more objective. So I'm going to introduce them. Antonio-Ruiz Camacho was born in Mexico and worked as a journalist for 18 years, occupying every imaginable position in a newsroom. He's a former Journalism Knight Fellow at Stanford, and he received an MFA from the New Writers Project at UT Austin. He's the author of Barefoot Dogs, a collection of short stories that the New York Times called lean and beautifully rendered, a deeply moving chronicle of one family's devastation, full of remarkable wisdom and humor, yet unflinching in its portrayal of the horrors sweeping Mexico. Marie Brenner has published 5 books and is a writer-at-large for Vanity Fair. Her books include Great Dames, What I Learned from Older Women, a memoir called Apples and Oranges, My Brother and Me, Lost and Found, which was one of Michiko Kakutani's New York Times top 10 favorite books of the year, and the best-selling House of Dreams, The Bingham Family of Louisville. She's also been a contributing editor for New York Magazine and The New Yorker, and 2 of her articles, and I think another one in progress, have been adapted for film, including her Vanity Fair piece, The Man Who Knew Too Much, which became the 1990 film The Insider, starring Al Pacino and Russell Crowe, and which was an amazing movie. And I want to ask you about that later, Marie. Amitava Kumar is a journalist and author of a novel and several works of nonfiction. His latest book, Lunch with a Bigot, is a collection of essays about the writer in the world that Kirkus Reviews called an exuberantly inquisitive collection of essays, and which Francine Prose said were the best sorts of essays, the kind in which the pleasure of reading derives from the pleasure of following a writer's mind as it moves from subject to subject, making us see connections of which we might otherwise have been unaware. Amitava was born in India in a town famous for its corruption, crushing poverty, and delicious mangoes. And he lives in upstate New York, where he teaches English at Vassar College. So I thought we would start with a question that I'd ask all three of you to address. That something came up this morning about what voices matter and what stories are important. And you have all written important stories about other people, representing other communities and other people's suffering and challenges. You've also written personal stories, memoir, personal essays. And those take, I think, a different kind of confidence and a different kind of courage. I wonder if you could just speak to the impulse, the different impulses in writing in writing pieces where you leave yourself in versus writing pieces where you take yourselves out. And maybe we can start with Amitava.
No, I don't have a microphone. Start with him.
Maybe we can start with Antonio.
Okay.
I'll show you, Amy, how it's done. Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming out. It's great to see all of you here, and it's great to be in this festival. It's still kind of unbelievable that we are all here. It's amazing. Well, to me, as Jan said, I've been working as a journalist for 18 years and writing fiction kind of in the back. And I thought a lot about why you write, even when you write nonfiction or when you become a journalist. And I think everything you write, even if it's journalism, has a personal component. There's a reason why you choose one topic over another. And I think you're always trying to reimagine yourself, to rediscover or understand yourself and the story that comes behind you. And that's something that I think, at least in my case, I'm over and over trying to understand. I grew up in Mexico in what I called a mixed class family. One side of my family was very poor, the other side of my family was very rich, which basically is like a metaphor for the country. So when growing up, I was trying to understand that particular circumstance that I was in. And I think I've tried to all the time understand and try to go back to that narrative, trying to understand it. So I think when you pick a story, you want it to be larger than yourself. You want to represent not your story or the story of a character in particular, but a story or the challenges of a group of people who are larger than your own circumstance. And I think that's, in my case, that's the way that I choose the topics that I write about.
Oh, Antonio, I could not agree with you more. Absolutely, so well said, and it's fantastic to be here. It's amazing to see how Boulder, which is my first time to Boulder, has been made to resemble the marvelous atmosphere at the Jaipur Literary Festival in India. Those of you who have been, it's just incredible how the same atmosphere is prevailing. Saying that, to go to your very interesting question, writing always comes for me, and I think for probably all three of us, from some form of passion, from some form of urge to bear witness. It's so difficult to write anything that if you aren't somehow brought into your subject by a deep emotional connection, an attempt to tell the human story, whether it's someone else's story or your own story, then you're probably not going to have a work that's going to move anyone. From me. I was going to just say that if you're not brought into a story by some sort of deep compulsion to bear witness, to try, however corny this sounds, to make the world a better place, to try to bring empathy and understanding to your characters, or sometimes just outrage. As a young journalist, I started out during the Watergate era, and I was so angry all the time. How could we have this president in the White House who was spying on people, who was breaking into people's offices? I came from South Texas, and at lunch, Antonio and I were discussing my family, half my family is as well from Mexico. And I was brought into my profession really by my family, because at our dinner table, my father helped finance whistleblowers in South Texas. My aunts were rather really terrific writers who lived in Mexico. And there was no conversation that was normal to suburbia of San Antonio that went on at our table. It was, how can I put the mayor in jail? I'm gonna get that son of a bitch. And so if you couldn't, there was no tennis, there was nothing about, I'm late to the country club to play racquetball, none of that. If you weren't out trying to do something to make the world better, then you just didn't belong in the family. So that's, so.
Well, like you guys, I'm also very happy to be here. If someone had offered me that phrase, Jaipur and Boulder, I would have thought I had smoked too much marijuana. So it's great. The surreal made real. There were many questions that you posed there, and I'll try to approach it in a way to address the topic, which is that I am taken in by a text when I hear a voice that is fresh or original and engaging. And that happens to me when I think that voice slides between fact and fiction in an interesting way. And when does that happen? I think a voice that is trying to keep the self out of the narrative is at pains to keep it out without that being a conscious intention. Doesn't interest us, doesn't interest me. A voice that is in some ways overwhelmed by the real, that is in some ways a slave to the depiction of the world outside, as if the writer and her sentences were not themselves constitutive of the world that this person was describing. That too underwhelms me. Because what you need is a voice that is responding to, that carries some sense of the grit of the real, but at the same time has the fictional in the sense of inventiveness visible on the page. Without that, it's shorn of interest. I often produce that writing, but I'm trying to set the desirable bar here.
I'm going to just follow on with that question. You are teaching or have taught a course called The In-Between Novel, which is a study of novels that resist narrative, if I understand it correctly, that maybe aren't interested in plot or setting or even character. Can you just say a little bit about how that is relevant to your own work and your own interest in literature?
The course I was teaching at Vassar was called The In-Between Novel. And I thought what I would include in the text, in the course, were novels that were fictional, that presented themselves as fiction, but they had large chunks of essays in them, or they sounded like essays at some point. The first book I taught was Elizabeth Hardwick's Sleepless Night. Another book I taught was Renata Adler's Speedboat. By the time we were ending the course, we were reading things like J.M. Coetzee's Elizabeth Costello and Teju Cole's Open City, where the writer is not afraid to draw you into a story, sure, but is not afraid to offer commentaries, essayistic riffs on the real, so that we are not bound to the conventions of one form of storytelling. Rather, you are jolting your reader awake by sliding across the boundary lines. So, just a quick footnote to that would be, I'm interested, as Jan said, I'm interested in journalism, I do journalism, but, and I want to smuggle, there's the thrill of the recognition of the real when you read on the page something that has, I don't know, let me aim low, Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. And then you find that in a novel by, I don't know, Philip Roth. And you think there's a thrill of the news being drawn into the novel. But at the same time, I also want a departure from what is plainly journalistic so that you are struck by the imagination of the artist who has transmuted it into something else.
Do either of you want to add to that at all while we're on this topic? Well, I'll ask you a question. You've been a journalist for a long time, yet your first book is fiction. Can you just say a bit about whether that is a transition in your career or whether do you think of yourself more as a fiction writer or more as a journalist? And, we're always trying to put people in boxes and categories. And we all write lots of different things, I think. And perhaps with a similar intention, but what was it about those stories that spoke to you in terms of fiction? Was it the story that decided you wanted to write in fiction, or did you decide you wanted to do that?
Well, I think I started writing fiction when I was in middle school. I just never thought that would be something I could do for a living.
Probably true.
Yeah.
For most of us.
Yeah, it could be like a profession. No? So I guess when I went into college and I chose a major, I realized that being a journalist was the closest I could be from being a writer and also have like a regular job. And also I enjoyed going out and just observing the world. I'm a rather shy person, so it was the difficult part for me when I was a reporter was doing interviews, just approaching people. But also when you're a journalist, you have that shield, that permission to go and approach people and just ask questions instead of just engaging in conversation. It was easier. But I think what I really wanted was to write fiction. With the stories in the book, I'll tell you very briefly what the book is about. It's a collection of linked stories about a family from Mexico City who must flee the country after their patriarch is kidnapped. And each story in the book follows a different member of the family as they face exile or the prospect of exile while still in Mexico City. And it's partly inspired by the wave of violence and kidnapping and extortion that Mexico has been through for the last almost 2 decades. And as a journalist, when you cover breaking news or these big events, you only have the time to go jump in, report on that story, the story of that day or that week, and then go to the next story. You don't have the time to spend, you're not afforded the time to spend time with the victims of those events and stay with them for a long time and see how these events affect them, not just them, but generations to come. And that's what I wanted to write about, the emotional consequences of that violence, not just in the people who are living it, but in their children, their grandchildren, the people around them. And fiction allowed me to write about this specific current event going on in Mexico through this different experience. So that, and it was very liberating because I couldn't have written this experience as an essay or even as a reportage. I would have had to spend many, many years with a family, and it would have been just impossible.
A question for Marie. Several of your pieces have been adapted for film. How involved were you in that process, and how closely was the film adaptation, how well did it represent what you wrote and the story as you understood it? How did it change when it turned into film?
Well, the movie that is the most, of course, resonant, I think, for me is The Insider. And in that sense, who could be, I mean, 3 geniuses adapt your work. I mean, so Michael Mann, Eric Roth, the cinematographer, you get those actors, Al Pacino and Russell Crowe. And Eric Roth, the screenwriter who was nominated for an Oscar for the screenplay, and rightly so, he's very inclusive. He wants to know, like a journalist, every detail. He wants to know what Jeffrey Wigand's daughter's puff dresses look like. And that's the way I research and the way Michael Mann researches. So we were 3 obsessives going crazy. In fact, the first time I met Michael Mann, he came with 2 black briefing books, 2 tape recorders, and I was a pulp by the time. I mean, he did an interview. He must have had 400 questions written out. Saying that, I think Antonio is really onto something about the emotional hot center of how someone deals with consequences of a dramatic event. And when I first met Jeffrey Wigand, he was on the verge of, he had just been thrown out of his family. His wife had thrown him out. He'd had 3 major death threats. He kept, I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, but there's a scenes in the movie where a journalist keeps calling him, and Lowell Bergman is the journalist in the movie, but any journalist trying to get to Jeffrey Wigand had the same experience where, incredibly, his phone number was listed in the Louisville Information. This is, I mean, God love information. So there he was, he would pick up the phone, he would slam it down, slam it down, slam it down. Finally, 2 months into the reporting, the magazine was in despair. I just flew down to Louisville and just moved into a hotel room. And that very next day, his wife threw him out because she was so terrified because Brown and Williams was really trying to get him. His life was truly in danger. And he had no place to go. And he's he's very, of course, traumatized. And so he left his wallet at his home. His wife had kept the wallet. So he had to call me to say, can I get a hotel room? So we put him in a hotel under an assumed name in the Hyatt in Louisville. And this was incredible because as a writer, you often see visual moments that will say everything metaphorically about a scene. I mean, for example, Mary Carr in her new book on memoir talks about Chekhov's Lady of the Lapdog, and that moment where this kind of terrible rake seduces a married woman, and she's sobbing, and he's just very cavalierly eating a piece of watermelon after this. But that was a metaphor because it actually showed who this character was. So at the Hyatt Hotel, you could look into, and I'm not making this up, the offices of Brown and Williamson. From the glass rooms of the Hyatt, we could see the Brown and Williamson lawyers and that whole staff who were out looking for Jeffrey Wigand. So when Michael and that detail was in what I did, but also when Michael made this movie, one of the most searing moments is you see Wigand looking back and forth. So again, this was about consequence. What were the consequences that went? How do you dramatize this?
Did seeing a story be realized in that way by those geniuses with your help change the way you approached storytelling when you were stuck with just words again?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I try to go to the inside out of a character, so I'm not thinking about how do I structure this. I'm thinking about who is this person? Because the fact is, I am a journalist, and facts do matter, and if facts, you can't conflate because, first of all, there's teams of lawyers and fact checkers who would catch you out in a second, but also it's wrong. You know, again, I'm old school, Watergate era. You just have to get it right. You can't do all the postmodern techniques of saying truthiness because it has to stand up. It has to stand up. It has to be right. And so the larger question is, I try to always find the personality who will inhabit a larger dramatic narrative, who will take us into the story, and by understanding his story, we understand a larger situation. You know, the attacks of the Jews in France, for example, I wrote about over the summer through the eyes of Sami Ghazlan, a retired French Jewish police commissioner. So I'm telling it through Ghazlan's point of view. So it's true, but it's also emotionally based.
And the way you talk about coming from the inside out makes me think that that's how we approach fiction. You know, we start with character. He's holding up the 5-minute sign, but that means we have 5 more minutes to talk, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So I had an experience. I published a novel, and I'm coming at it the opposite direction from you all because I've never written anything but fiction. And then the first thing my publicist said was, you know, what we'd like you to do now is some writing. And I was like, you want me to do some writing? I just spent 10 years writing this book. Well, we need you to write some personal essays so that you can get your name out there and so on. And I started writing personal essays, and I realized that I was not capable of writing a personal essay that stuck entirely to the truth, although I tried very hard. And I was also not capable of writing fiction that didn't use some of my own life. And I just want to ask you if any of you have had an experience where you just really didn't quite tell the whole truth when you were supposed to be. And I'm speaking not when it was journalism, but when it was a personal story, you know, a memoir or a personal essay.
I feel there's a sense of, I feel an accusation in that question, so I feel I should own up. I hope all of you are paying attention. I was paying attention to what Marie was saying, and I'm not going to eat a watermelon again in a woman's company. That's the first thing. That's the fact. Listen, I think there's a fundamental misconception at the heart of this panel. People in America think it's very important to know, did this really happen? You know, it's the high point of the satisfaction of the moral impulse. My wife, when she reads some outrageous thing I've written, will say, did this happen? I think it's a very unfair question. Also, an unimportant question. The last time she asked was because of I went to a series of booksellers in New York City, and with a straight face, I would just go to the counter and I say, where is your white literature section? And the responses were so hilarious. She kept, when my wife said, did this happen? And I thought, I think the moral impulse, if you have to satisfy your moral impulse, you should do something for the refugees from Syria, you know? You shouldn't be asking, did this really happen? Was it the 7th floor from which you jumped, or was it the 18th floor? I think that, you know, Nabokov published much of Speak Memory, his memoir, in the New Yorker as fiction. Later on, they became essays, you know, part of the memoir. People play around with categories. They take liberties. To exercise your imagination means that you can mess around with these categories, which do not necessarily fulfill any high purpose. Also, it's a way of dealing with your emotions, you know? Writing about my mother's funeral, thinking about the distance that you find between yourself and the person who is grieving, which at certain moments you recognize is yourself. It is you. That thought has occurred in you. Made me think maybe I should write it in the, you know, in the second person, you. It's a very familiar thing, but it is. We should ask ourselves, does this work? How does this work? What has the writer done with his or her material? Rather than ask, is it all true? She's still thinking about the watermelon. Did I damage Amitava's life?
The hardest writing for me has been writing a memoir about my own family, where the truth, the emotional, subjective, people's sensitivities, my book, Apples and Oranges, cut across about 3 generations of my family. So in some senses, I was back in Mexico in the 1920s and 30s, and of course, you're not relying on witnesses, you're relying on projection, what you've been told, what you've been able to glean from family archives, and there is some degree of fact-checking that you cannot ever put to that standard. But there is a higher standard, which is this emotionally true? Is this emotionally true from me? And that is, of course, when you're inventing a character, crucial. It's crucial. Saying that, writing across the mediums is extraordinarily powerful and creative. And for me, the essence of this is you have to put aside every scintilla of fear, of your sense you will be judged, because creativity can never come out of thinking someone is on your shoulder. Again, to quote Mary Carr in her new book, she said, writing a memoir means you have to knock yourself out. And that's right.
And that is beautifully said, Marie, thank you. We're going to open it up for questions. I was told by someone involved with the conference that people in Boulder like to talk a lot, and that's wonderful because you have this amazing, intelligent community out there with lots of ideas, but please ask a question. If you have a question, we have our panelists here for a reason.
So I have 2 questions. First question, if you know nobody else will read your work, will it differ from what you write when it's in the public domain, when you put it in the public domain, as in the fact and the fiction that we're talking about? If it's just for yourself, you're just penning it down knowing nobody else will ever see it, will it be any different?
It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. If it's honest, if it's true, you should just go for it and not think about who will read it, who won't, because as we all know from the web, if it's in your computer, it will be read.
I have had the experience of, after publishing a novel, I mean, when you first start to write a novel, you assume nobody's ever going to read it, and chances are nobody is ever going to read it, and then, somehow it gets published, and I have found that to be difficult, because you know your agent is at least going to read it, and I think you have to get over that hump and put yourself back into that more innocent time.
So the question was more as in, even if when the agent is not in the picture, I mean, you don't have any intent of publishing it. You're just trying to just let it all out with no intentions of publishing it. Because then you improvise, right? Because you want to make it fancy. You want people to read it. And that's where you mix fact and fiction. Well, that was the first question. Second question, you are journalists. Is or can a journalist ever be completely objective? And I'll cite an example, like the latest Kim Davis controversy. You can be on either side of the spectrum. How easy or difficult is it for you to just report the fact and not let your biases creep in?
Which
Antonio,
controversy? I couldn't hear you. Which
the
controversy?
Kim Davis controversy, the clerk in Rowan County in Kentucky. She refused to give licenses to
the Kentucky marriage license.
Exactly.
Well, I'll ask. Oh, you take this.
Antonio, maybe you take this, and we haven't heard enough from you.
Well, I think as a journalist, you have a responsibility to not. Probably objective is become like a complicated word, but to offer all the points of view that are worth being part of the story, in order for your reader to understand the story. You don't have to report on both sides of the story if one of the sides offers delusional information, for example. You have to report on facts, and you have to be to have that information on all the sides that are relevant to the story. That's my stance.
That's what is relevant, because somebody who's reading Fox News,
I think we need to let other people have hands up, but thank you.
I wondered if any of you have read Catherine Boo's Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and what you think of her turning interviews into a novel, and how that fit.
It's not a novel, but it's creative nonfiction.
It's a fascinating book. Fascinating because despite having done hundreds and thousands of interviews, a notable part of that being using the Right to Information Act to get information, she has entirely evacuated the sense of the personal being there all the time. So it interests me on that level of craft as a wonderful book. I'm not entirely sure I support that evacuation of the self, because there are certain conditions that make the writer's presence in that slum possible. And in my opinion, the imbrication, why she was there, what was happening to her, would have added a wonderful texture to the story, in my opinion. So those are my two quick comments on it.
Another question?
I have a fiction writing related question. How do you approach a character or a plot or a theme which is completely diametrically opposite to your own convictions and your own worldview? Suppose you are a liberal atheist, how do you approach a character who is a devout Southern conservative or a born-again Christian?
Well, I can just speak to this. I recently, Montana Book Festival was last weekend, and then one of the authors there said that he had this situation where he was writing from the point of view of a character who was expecting the end of the world to come any time. And he said that the way he did that was to get into kind of a meditative state where he actually imagined what it would be like to believe. So he had, in a way, to believe it. himself in order to write from that point of view. And I think you have to do that in order to have empathy for your character, in order for your character to be fully realized.
A quick comment. I went to this lunch with a bigot is a meeting with a man who put me on a hit list. So when I called him, he abused me and then agreed to meet me. Now at the meeting, he was violent in his speech, vile actually, and said vile things about my wife, for example. My wife was worried about me when I was going out, and the police had come to my house to say this guy had put me on a hit list. So I had to call her to tell her that the interview is over. And I made the mistake of telling her some of the things he had said about her. And she said, "What did you say?" And I said nothing, because I was thinking in my mind that I must remember everything he's saying. And this notebook that I have, that when I get on the train, I'm going to write it down. I think that is the writer's dharma, Observation rather than judgment.
Thank you.
Are we done? Are we out of time?
No, if I may add to that question, I think that the fun part of writing fiction is exactly writing about people who are not yourself, who are very different from the person you are. So the exercise is just to, I guess as fiction writers, we aspire to create characters that are compelling and full-blown and believable enough that people come at you and ask you, "Oh, this really happened?" Or "Where did you get this information? Does this person really exist?" And it's just all made up. No, it's not yourself. So I think that's what every fiction writer basically does.
If I could just add to that eloquent thought. Very quickly, these two questions are linked about Catherine Boo's book, Behind the Beautiful Forevers, and your question, because what we're talking about again is empathy. It is the writer's obligation to look at someone who may not have anything in common with you and to try to understand their point of view without judgment, to create them for the reader, as Catherine Boo does so beautifully and brilliantly in Behind the Beautiful Forevers, which is the ultimate exercise in empathy and being in an exotic setting which she would never be able to understand without really moving into that life and understanding that life in the chole of Bombay.
I think we still have time, according to my watch, so take another question. Yes, in the back.
I couldn't hear that. Could you hear that?
I'm saying that some of the sort of fictional writers like Carl Hiaasen, John MacDonald, Ed Abbey's not, well, he's an example too, and Paolo Bacigalupi, they have a much wider audience. They're not as artful, they're not appreciated by critics. They're not doing the wonderful stuff you're doing with The Insider and with journalism, but they come from a journal. I mean, Carl Hiaasen was a journalist for years at the Miami. Anyway, the theory about how you get your values way out to more and more people by a mixture of journalism and the creativity.
Anybody want to take that? I think it's a question about reach.
Voice.
How do you reach more people? I guess, and through this blend of fiction, and does that matter? Maybe is the other question.
And you're also talking about voice. I mean, who's funnier than Carl Hiaasen? He's fantastic. God, you could just be able to walk around with a tape recorder, writing down and taping every funny thing he says about living in Florida is just heaven.